Hello everybody. So today we are going to learn about comparing decimals. Now we have learned about comparing numbers and fractions, and so now we're going to use a similar process to compare decimals. Now we have been learning about decimals for the past 5 lessons or so, but we are going to quickly review some key concepts. So first we're going to review the different parts of a decimal. So here we have the ones place, and then we have the decimal point, and then we have the tenths and the hundredths place. Those are the place values that we have learned thus far, and so we are only going to be comparing decimals with these place values in them. Something else we need to review quickly are the comparison symbols. Now we've used these when comparing fractions and when comparing numbers. So we're just going to review them really quickly. The arrow pointing this way means less than. We have equal to with the equal sign, and then greater than, which I like to remember that symbol as it kind of looks like Pac-Man. And Pac-Man is always going to eat the bigger number. So that's an easy way to remember that, but we are going to use these symbols to help us compare different decimals. Now, comparing decimals is a little different than fractions or numbers because we have to look at each place value. It is very important to look at each place value. So here I have some examples. I've filled out the first one. So we have 32 hundredths, or 0.32, in comparison to 0.51, or 51 hundredths. So what you're going to do first is you're going to compare the ones place. They're both 0, so we don't have any comparison there. They're equal. So then we look at the tenths. We have a 3 and we have a 5. Now 3 is less than 5, so that helps us in the first part of the comparison. And then we look at our hundredths, 2 and 1. So the important part here is that tenths number because 3 is less than 5. So 32 hundredths is going to be less than, with the arrow pointing this way, 51 hundredths. So on our second example, we have 0.2 or 2 tenths and 0.15 or 15 hundredths. Now this is where it can get a little tricky when comparing decimals. Many people think that 0.15 or 15 hundredths is larger because it has more numbers after the decimal point, but this is not true. Here we have it in tenths and here is in hundredths. So an easy way to help compare these two decimals are to add a 0 right there and then mix them both in hundredths. So now 0.20 or 20 hundredths is greater than 0.15 or 15 hundredths. It's a similar situation with the next one. Many people think that 0.60 or 60 hundredths is greater than 0.6 or 6 tenths. But we have to look at the place values and recognize that this is in tenths and this one is in hundredths. So we need to make them equivalent. It makes comparing decimals a lot easier if we try to make them in the same place value. So I'm just going to add a 0 like I did in the previous problem. Now we have 60 hundredths and 60 hundredths. So when we compare the two, they are going to be equal to each other. And we just simply use an equal sign. Now, a way that I like to also do these types of problems is to use models. Now, these are both models that have 100 parts to them because oftentimes it's easier if both the decimals are not in tenths and one of them is in hundredths, it's easier to just do everything out of 100. So in our first one, we have 0.22 or 22 hundredths. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to shade 22 of these squares because there's 100 total. 100 will make one whole. So I will do that quickly. So there I have 22 hundredths filled. Now, this decimal is in tenths. So to change that to hundredths, we're simply going to add a 0. Now with that 0, it is now 20 hundredths. And so I'm able to fill out 20 of these squares. So as you can see, here are 22 squares filled, and here are 20 squares filled. So it provides a nice visual for you to be able to see which one is larger. So we can conclude that 22 hundredths is greater than 20 hundredths. So not only can we use those two decimals, but we can also use this model to see it visually.